Edinburgh Zoo is one of those places that almost everyone in the UK has heard of, whether that's because of the famous penguins or simply because of its dramatic setting overlooking the city of Edinburgh. It's a zoo with a strong reputation, a long history and a very clear public image, but reputation and reality don't always line up, especially when you start looking closely at modern zoo design, animal welfare and how effectively habitats are designed around the needs of species living in them. In this video I want to take a slow, detailed look at Edinburgh Zoo, not just as a day out but as a collection of habitats, design decisions and ideas about how animals should be housed and presented. I'll be taking the layout of the zoo and how the land itself influences the enclosures, and then working through the majority of the main habitats and species in detail. Along the way I'll be sharing what I personally liked, what I think works particularly well and where I feel improvements could be made. I'll then finish with my overall thoughts on the zoo as a whole and where it sits within modern zoological standards. Edinburgh Zoo is operated by the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland and conservation messaging is present throughout the site. The question I want to keep coming back to is how well this mission translates into actual lived experience of the animals, and in the design of the habitats themselves. Before getting into individual species though, it's important to talk about the layout of the zoo because at Edinburgh Zoo the land defines almost everything. One of the first things you notice when visiting Edinburgh Zoo is just how steep it is. The zoo is built on the Corstorphine Hill and is designed to have a huge impact on both visitor experience and the way the animal habitats are designed. From an animal welfare and exhibit design perspective, this landscape can be a real advantage. The slopes allow enclosures to be built with natural elevation changes, long sight lines, and a sense of scale that would be much harder to achieve on flat ground. Many habitats feel larger than they technically are because the animals can move up and down, disappear behind rises in the land, and choose where they want to be within the space. From a visitor perspective though, this terrain can be challenging. There are steep paths throughout the zoo, and while there are accessibility routes and transport options available, sometimes they can be limited. Visiting Edinburgh Zoo does require a certain amount of physical effort. This means that impressions are important because you're immediately committed to a fair amount of walking. What I do think works well with the zoo is the overall pacing. The most physical demanding sections tend to come earlier in the visit with more gradual descents throughout many of the major habitats later on. If you plan your route properly, the zoo flows reasonably well and the landscape starts to feel like a feature rather than an obstacle. One of the first habitats you encounter is the Meerkat enclosure, and it works well as an introduction to the zoo. The habitat is open, well positioned and immediately lively, which helps draw visitors in and sets the tone for the day. The enclosure uses raised ground, digging substrate and multiple lookout points that allow the meerkats to express natural behaviours like burrowing, standing guard and social interaction. Visibility is excellent without feeling intrusive, and the animals tend to be active for much of the day, which makes it a strong early exhibit. If there's a criticism here, it's that the enclosure is relatively compact compared to some newer meerkat exhibits elsewhere, but the way the space is structured helps maximise its usefulness. It's a confident, engaging start to the visit. Moving on, the red panda habitat feels like a deliberate shift in tone. Where the meerkats are open and energetic, this closure is quieter and more vertical. The habitat makes strong use of height with climbing structures, elevated pathways and dense planting that allows the red pandas to move above eye level. This is important for a species that naturally prefers arboreal movement and a degree of separation from ground level activity. One of the strengths here is choice. The red pandas can be clearly visible, partially hidden or completely out of sight depending on where they choose to rest. While that can sometimes frustrate visitors, it's exactly what this kind of enclosure should offer. The space feels designed around the animals and comfort, rather than guaranteed viewing from the guests. The Chinese goral enclosure is one of the habitats that doesn't draw huge crowds, but quietly benefits from Edinburgh Zoo's terrain. Built into a sloped area, the habitat allows the animals to move naturally across uneven ground, mimicking the rockery mountainous environments they are adapted to. The enclosure feels functional rather than immersive, but still suits the species well. The gorals have the space to climb, rest at an elevation and keep distance from visitors. It's not a flashy habitat, but it's an appropriate one, and sometimes that matters more. The low-hiss monkey enclosure sits somewhere between older and newer design philosophies. The space provides climbing opportunities, multiple levels and adequate room for movement, but it lacks the dense planting and visual complexity seen more in relative developed primate habitats. The monkeys are able to socialise and move vertically, which is crucial, but the enclosure feels a little exposed. With more planting and more varied textures and a greater visual barrier, this space could be significantly improved. As it stands, it does the job, but it doesn't fully capitalise on the potential of the species. The penguin habitat is one of the most recognisable parts of Edinburgh Zoo, and it's easy to see why. The enclosure is built around a large pool, allowing visitors to see the penguins swimming with speed and precision. On the land, the sloped terrain encourages walking and social interaction between the penguins, and the openness of the space creates a strong sense of connection between visitors and animals. The famous penguin walk adds to the sense of accessibility and spectacle. From a welfare perspective, the penguins have good swimming space and social opportunities. But this is also one of the most crowded areas of the zoo. During busy periods, the sheer number of people can be overwhelming, and I'd like to see more clearly defined retreat areas that allow the penguins to fully remove themselves from that noise if they want to. The rhino enclosure is notable for its scale. The space is large, open and straightforward, giving the animals plenty of room to move, graze and rest. The habitat priorities function over immersion, and while it may not be the most visually exciting enclosure, it does allow the rhinos to express natural behaviours. Additional environmental enrichment and more varied terrain could improve it further, but the fundamentals are solid and there. The porcupine enclosure is easy to overlook, but it's a good example of a habitat that suits a less active, more nocturnal species. The space provides shelter, digging opportunities and shaded areas that allow the animals to rest during the day. This is not a high energy exhibit, but it doesn't need to be. The enclosure respects the animals' natural rhythms, even if that means visitors sometimes see very little happening within the animal enclosure. The otter habitat at Edinburgh Zoo is lively and engaging, centred around a substantial flowing water feature that supports a full range of natural behaviours, including swimming, diving, chasing and playful interaction. The water appears deep and dynamic enough to encourage underwater movement, rather than just surface paddling, which is particularly important for such an agile aquatic species. The layout promotes frequent transitions between land and water, with gentle sloped edges, haul-out points and varied terrain that encourages exploration and constant movement. This fluid connection between environments reflects the otter's natural rhythms and helps them maintain a high level of activity throughout the day. On land, the enclosure provides opportunities for resting, social interaction, and scanning the surroundings, giving the animals multiple ways to engage with their space. Visitor visibility is generally strong, with clear sightlines that make it easy to observe the otters both in and out the water, often during active behaviours. The enclosure feels well used and animated, suggesting the animals are comfortable and stimulated within it. While additional planting, denser vegetation or visual barriers could further enhance immersion and provide more choice of privacy, the habitat is clearly designed with behavioural enrichment at its core. Overall, it stands out as a solid, thoughtfully constructed enclosure that prioritises activity, movement and species-appropriate behaviour over purely aesthetic concerns. The Pygmy hippo habitat at Edinburgh Zoo is thoughtfully designed around shade, water and privacy, closely reflecting the species' natural, reclusive and heat-sensitive behaviour. The enclosure includes pools that allow the animals to wallow, cool down and maintain skin moisture, as well as sheltered areas where they can rest away from direct sunlight and visitor presence. These features give the hippos clear choice and control over how they use the space throughout the day. The habitat has calm, subdued atmosphere that feels appropriate rather than understimulating. Movement tends to be unhurried, and the design supports quiet exploration and extended periods of rest. Visibility for visitors can vary, particularly when the animals opt to shaded and covered areas, but this area appears to be intentionally traded off. Rather than prioritising constant display, the enclosure places animal comfort, low stress and natural behaviour rhythms firmly at the centre of its design. The sun bear enclosure is a habitat that immediately feels like it's pointing in the right direction, even if it doesn't quite reach its full potential yet. The space itself is generous, with enough room for the bears to move around comfortably, and there are clear attempts to incorporate climbing opportunities, which are absolutely essential for a species that naturally spends a great deal of time off the ground. The enclosure uses changes in elevation and solid structures to encourage movement and exploration, and when the bears are active you do see moments that feel natural and purposeful. That said, the space also feels comparatively open in places, and I think this is where the habitat could be strengthened. Denser planting and more suspended enrichment and additional complexity in the climbing structures would help the enclosure with a wider range of behaviours, particularly foraging and problem solving. At the moment, the enclosure feels like a strong framework rather than a finished product. The fundamentals are there, but compared to some of the other progressive modern bear habitats, it lacks an extra layer of environmental richness that really pushes a behavioural diversity. It's a good habitat, but it feels like one that could be made great with relatively targeted improvements. The warty pig enclosure is a good example of a habitat that succeeds by focusing on the basics and executing them well. The space provides suitable substrate for rooting and digging, which is a key behavioural need for pigs, and there are clear areas for wallowing, resting and social interaction. The layout allows the animals to move naturally through the enclosure without feeling constrained, and the pigs are often engaged in purposeful activity rather than pacing or inactivity. This is not an exhibit that aims to impress visually, and it doesn't rely on dramatic landscaping or immersive theming, but it does what it needs to do for the species it houses. From a visitor perspective, it's a quieter habitat, but one that rewards observation. Watching the pigs forage, interact and move through the space gives a strong sense that the enclosure has been designed with behavioural needs firmly in mind. The koala enclosure is one of the most carefully controlled environments in the zoo, and that's immediately apparent when you consider how specialised this species is. Koalas have very specific dietary, temperature and humidity requirements, and the enclosure reflects a design philosophy built around precision rather than scale. The habitat is structured vertically, with climbing opportunities that allow the koalas to rest and move in ways that reflect their natural behaviour. Access to appropriate eucalyptus is central to the design of the enclosure, and the environment feels calm, stable and deliberately managed. While the enclosure isn't large, it doesn't feel inadequate. Instead, it feels purpose-built. This is a space that is designed very much to meet the exact needs of the koalas, and while it may lack visual drama, it prioritises the health and comfort of the animals above everything else. In that sense, it's a good example of function taking precedent over spectacle. The kangaroo and wallaby habitats offer a noticeable shift in pace as you move through the zoo. These enclosures feel open, calm and expansive, encouraging both animals and visitors to slow down. The layout allows the animals to graze and move freely across shared space, and the use of Edinburgh Zoo's natural terrain adds the sense of openness. There's a relaxed, almost partial quality to the habitats, which suits the species extremely well. The animals appear comfortable and at ease, often resting or moving casually through the space rather than sticking to the edges. From a visitor perspective, these enclosures are important because they provide breathing room. They create moments of calm between more intense and crowded exhibits, and they encourage observations rather than spectacle. It's a simple approach but a very effective one at that. The tiger enclosure is one of the strongest habitats at Edinburgh Zoo, and a clear example of how space, distance and choice can dramatically improve animal welfare. The enclosure is large and layered with a mix of open ground, wooded areas and elevated resting spots that allow the tiger to move through the space in a natural and purposeful way. One of the most striking aspects of this habitat is the distance it creates between the animals and the visitors. Tigers are often observed from afar, resting or moving slowly through the enclosure, and this distance reinforces a sense of dignity rather than display. The tiger is not pressed up against the glass or pacing along the barrier, it exists on its own terms. Visibility is unpredictable, and there will always be visits where you will see very little of the tigers, but that unpredictability is exactly what makes the habitat work. It prioritises the animal's autonomy and comfort, and when you do catch a sight of the tiger, the experience was earned rather than staged. The baboon enclosure is designed around the needs of a highly social and dynamic species. Space is at the centre feature here, allowing the group to move, spread out and interact in complex ways. Social hierarchies, play, conflict and cooperation all unfold naturally within the enclosure. The habitat provides opportunities for climbing and movement, but it does feel like an area where additional vertical elements would enhance the space further. More elevated structures and varied climbing options would likely add even more behavioural richness to the habitat. That said, the enclosure succeeds in its primary goal, which is to allow the social group to function as a group. Watching the baboons interact is engaging and unpredictable, and a habitat that supports that complexity is very well done. The Przewalski horse's habitat makes an excellent use of open space, creating an environment that feels expansive and calm. The animals are able to graze, move together or maintain distance from one another as needed, which is essential for a species adapted to wide, open landscapes. The enclosure has a strong sense of scale, and the horses are not confined to a small, visually compressed area. Instead, they occupy the space in a way that feels natural and unenforced. This is a habitat that doesn't rely on complexity or enrichment structures. Because this species, space itself is enrichment. It's a simple but very effective design. The giraffe enclosure at Edinburgh Zoo is designed to emphasise vertical scale, which is central to a species defined by height and browsing behaviour. Tall feeding structures draw the giraffe's attention upwards, encouraging natural foraging through stretching and reaching rather than ground level feeding. This allows their distinctive posture and movement to be seen clearly. The space feels open and uncluttered, and the giraffes are often observed moving calmly between feeding points, reinforcing a sense of slow, deliberate activity rather than constant motion. Visibility is genuinely strong, with clear sight lines that showcase the animal's size and proportions without making them feel overly exposed to visitors. At ground level, the habitat is relatively simple, and additional variation and enrichment could encourage a broader range of behaviours from the giraffes. Even so, the enclosure succeeds in highlighting the giraffe's natural elegance, scale and browsing style, creating a habitat that prioritises posture and presence over a high level of activity. The anteater enclosure at Edinburgh Zoo is another strong example of a habitat designed around a very specific and demanding set of needs. The species incorporates a suitable substrate that allows for digging and probing behaviour, alongside climbing structures and logs that encourage exploration and low-level movement. These elements support the anteater's natural foraging style and physical capabilities, rather than forcing activity for display. Environmental conditions within the enclosure appear carefully controlled, reflecting the species' sensitivity to temperature and humidity. Sheltered areas and warm indoor spaces allow the animals to regulate its comfort, particularly during colder weather, while still offering opportunities to move between different zones of the habitat. This flexibility supports a routine that feels natural and unhurried. This is not a visually dramatic enclosure, and it's clearly not intended to be. Anteaters are subtle, deliberate animals, and the design reflects and understands nature rather than trying to manufacture spectacle. Visibility can be quiet and understated, but visitors who take their time and watch closely are often rewarded with slow, purposeful behaviour, sniffing, climbing, and methodical movement that feels authentic and behaviour-led rather than performance. The zebra habitat at Edinburgh Zoo is designed as a broad, open paddock that prioritises space, visibility and group movement. The enclosure allows the zebras to move freely across the terrain, maintaining visual contact with one another and exhibiting natural herd dynamics. The openness suits the species that relies on awareness of its surroundings and benefits from room to walk, graze and reposition within a social group. The design encourages steady, purposeful movement rather than concentrated activity. Zebras are often seen walking the length of the enclosure, grazing or standing alert together, behaviours that feel natural and unforced. Sightlines are clear, allowing visitors to observe the group interactions and body language without the animals appearing crowded or constrained. While the habitat is relatively simple in structure, with limited environmental complexity, it functions well for a plains-dwelling species that thrives in open landscapes. Additional variation in terrain or enrichment could add further behavioural interest, but the enclosure succeeds in presenting zebras as social, mobile animals. Overall, it's a functional, spacious habitat that supports natural movement and ground behaviour rather than spectacle or constant activity. The lion enclosure at Edinburgh Zoo makes a strong and deliberate use of distance, elevation and separation from visitors, allowing the animals to occupy raised resting areas that overlook both their territory and the surrounding landscape. These elevated platforms reinforce natural vantage point behaviour, with lions often choosing to rest above ground level, surveying their environment, rather than remaining at eye level. When the lions are visible, the effort is striking. The animals frequently appear calm, composed and confident, often reclining or sitting in positions that suggest control rather than alertness or agitation. The scale of the enclosure and the space between the animals and viewers enhances this impression, preventing the sense of confinement that can undermine the presence of large predators. Equally important is the enclosure's allowance for choice. The lions are able to move out of sight when they wish, retreating to less visible areas without disruption. This reinforces a broader theme seen throughout Edinburgh Zoo, where the animal autonomy is prioritised over guaranteed viewing opportunities. The habitat feels restrained and intentional in its design, avoiding theatrical elements or artificial drama. Instead, it presents the lions with dignity, focusing on space, perspective and behaviour or authenticity. The result is an enclosure that emphasises respect and presence rather than spectacle, and one that aligns well with the natural authority of this species. The sloth enclosure at Edinburgh Zoo is appropriately understated, reflecting the species' slow pace and energy-conserving lifestyle, rather than attempting to manufacture activity. The habitat provides a network of sturdy climbing structures, branches and supports that allow for careful, deliberate movement, alongside stable environmental conditions that support thermoregulation and comfort. The space encourages vertical use without pressure to move, allowing the sloth to rest for extended periods of time or shift position gradually over time. Movement when it occurs is subtle and unhurried, reinforcing the sense that the enclosure is designed to accommodate the animal's natural rhythm rather than disrupt it. This is not an exhibit built around excitement or spectacle, and it doesn't try to be. Instead, it respects the sloth's behavioural ecology and asks visitors to slow down in response. Those who spend time observing are rewarded with moments of quiet, authentic behaviour that feel genuine and unforced, aligning the enclosure firmly with welfare and realism over constant stimulation for the animals. The chimpanzee enclosure, in my opinion, is the standout habitat at Edinburgh Zoo and a strong example of contemporary primate exhibit design in the modern day. The outdoor space offers substantial vertical complexity with tall climbing frames, towers and ropes, and elevated platforms that encourage three-dimensional movement and give the chimps meaningful control over height, distance and visibility. This vertical emphasis supports natural climbing and resting at vantage points. The indoor habitat is particularly impressive and deserves specific recognition. Rather than serving as a simple off-show holding area, it functions as a fully recognised living space with significant height, multiple interconnected levels and a robust climbing structure. The design allows chimpanzees to remain active, social and sparsely distributed, even when indoors, supporting a wide range of behaviours including movement, play, grooming and quiet retreat. Natural light, varied textures and clear internal sightlines contribute to an environment that feels considered rather than purely functional. Across both indoor and outdoor areas, there is ample space for the group to interact while also providing opportunities for separation and avoidance, which is essential for managing the species' complex social relationships. The enclosure allows tensions to dispute naturally, rather than being forced by spatial limitations. Movement through the habitat is fluid and purposeful, and social interactions are often layered and absorbing to watch. The habitat feels constantly well used, suggesting that it offers genuine choice and stimulation, rather than unused features. Overall, the enclosure stands out for not only for its scale, but also its restraint and behavioural focus, presenting chimpanzees as intelligent, socially complex animals within a space that respects both their physical and psychological needs. When taken as a whole, Edinburgh Zoo feels like an institution that is genuinely trying to place animal welfare at the centre of its decision making, while still operating as a major public attraction within Scotland. There is a clear awareness of the ongoing tension between visitor expectations and the realities of keeping animals responsibly, and in many cases the zoo is willing to prioritise animal choice, space and privacy, even when that results in limited visibility or quieter visitor experiences. As you move through the site, it becomes apparent that this is a zoo in transition, rather than a truly unified modern complex. Some habitats clearly reflect contemporary welfare-led zoo design principles, with an emphasis on space, complexity and behavioural choice, while others retain a more traditional feel. That contrast is noticeable, but it also feels honest. Edinburgh Zoo has been redeveloped all at once. Instead, it is evolving incrementally, constrained by its historical layout, hillside terrain and the practical limits of working site by site. The steep open hillside setting plays a significant role in shaping both animal spaces and visitor experience. The zoo asks visitors to walk, climb and slow down as they move between exhibits, and in return it offers enclosures that feel expansive, less crowded and more respectful towards the animals within them. Distance is used deliberately, particularly for large or sensitive species, reinforcing a sense of scale and autonomy rather than proximity. Animals are frequently distant or temporarily out of sight, which may frustrate visitors, expecting constant viewing, but this reinforces the impression that the animals are living on their own terms, rather than performing on demand. It encourages patience and observation rather than passive consumption. Edinburgh Zoo is not without its weaknesses, and some areas would clearly benefit from further redevelopment or modernisation. Even so, the overall impression of the zoo is a thoughtful, self-aware and committed to gradual improvement. For visitors willing to adjust their expectations and engage on zoo terms, it offers a rewarding experience built around respect, realism and long-term welfare rather than spectacle, an approach that feels increasingly rare and genuinely valuable. So that's my walkthrough and overall thoughts of Edinburgh Zoo. It's definitely not a perfect zoo, and there are areas that clearly show their age and could benefit from further development, but it's also a place that feels genuinely thoughtful and increasingly welfare focused. The effort to give animals space, choice and privacy comes through across much of the site, and for me that counts a great deal. If you visited the zoo yourself, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Whether you agree with my take, had a very different experience, or noticed things I didn't, feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video or found it useful or thought-provoking, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. I'll be sharing more zoo and theme park content videos with a focus on animal habitats design and visitor experience in the future. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.